look at Valentina Petrillo on a track running as a 51-year-old male, and we can see that he's male, right? This is very obvious to us, and I think it hits right to us thinking, I remember, when I was being beaten up by my big brother, or in the playground at school. We understand this mismatch between sexes isn't fair. So sport hits us quite, I think, in our heart.
So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Peter Copeland, Deputy Director in the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and as leading national public policy think tank, it is my great pleasure to be joined today by Professor Emma Hilton. Emma is a developmental biologist at the University of Manchester, studying aspects of human genetic disease. She's also a trustee with Sex Matters, a human rights charity that promotes clarity about sex in law, policy, and language in order to protect everybody's rights. In recent years, she's been animated by the issue of sex in sport and taken her biological expertise and concern for fairness and human rights to the issue. And Emma has written reports for MLI before, and it's great to have you back. Thanks for joining us, Emma.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, we'll dive right in. The most recent issue in the minds of many when it comes to sex in sport is the Olympics. What were some of the issues that arose with respect to biological males competing in female categories?
Yeah, we've had a couple of phases now of the Olympics and now the Paralympics. And in the regular Olympics, the able-bodied Olympics, what we saw was within the boxing competition, two athletes who had been banned for failing to meet eligibility criteria for the female category by their boxing federation. But the competition in the Paris Olympics was being run by the International Olympic Committee, who have different criteria for eligibility. And they allowed two athletes in to the female category in boxing, who we understand are XY males with DSDs. So by that, I mean disorders of sex development. So these are people who are male, who may have been observed as female at birth, who may have a legal identity as female, but who biologically are carrying male advantage. And by that, I mean the typical pattern of male development that we understand confers athletic advantage. So things like height, broad shoulders, bigger muscles, all those things that, make not just men run faster, but in a boxing ring can punch a lot harder. And so that's clearly in boxing, not just an issue of fairness, but also a really serious issue of safety. Okay, so we have this conflict between federations, the International Boxing Association, who said not eligible, and the International Olympic Committee, who said come and box with females. And now with the Paralympics, what we're seeing is a transgender woman, and by that I mean someone who's male, who identifies as a woman, and who, in their kind of social life perhaps wishes to be perceived as a woman, but ultimately is a male who is born male, who has developed until the age of 45 as a male, and who is a really actually quite a good male athlete, right? Who is now transitioned and is now running against
use
females,
the services
and has, displaced female athletes who are really very vulnerable, right? This is the Paralympics and the opportunities are slim. And so we have these two halves of the Olympic competition this year. It's been interesting.
Okay, yeah. So you've spoken about how sex differences manifest physically with respect to running and boxing, but there are many different sports, and sex is certainly pervasive and exists throughout them. So how does it manifest across the board? I mean, to varying degree, I'm sure, but there are, I would imagine, significant sex-based differences in just about every category. Is that fair to say?
So anything that's really obviously athletic, so anything that requires, strength for sure. The minute you can see someone throw something or try and run towards something, you know that males are going to have an advantage over females. There is a few, or rather, there are a few sports where one might think that the male advantage is smaller than some others. So, for example, there are precision sports. By that, I mean things like archery and shooting, where perhaps the male advantage is smaller. It's still there. You can still find it. Even in archery, which people think is, kind of a very easy lifting of a bow and it's all about the aim. Actually, the drawing of a bow and those kinds of, muscular strength around your shoulders start to play into it. So there is male advantage even in these precision sports. Um, and then we run through the whole kind of spectrum when we think about running, a very basic movement, right? One foot in front of the other, running. We think about something like 10%, the same in swimming. When we start to jump, we're looking at a 20% gap between males and females. But when we're thinking about throwing, male strength is so disproportionate in their upper body that when we get to throwing event, the gap can be 50 or 60%. And when we think about punching, which really is a whole body movement, right? Feet planted on the floor, a core rotating, narrow hips, big shoulders, big levers, big strength. We're looking at 250% gaps between males and females. So really quite a big spectrum, but even in the non-athletic sports, still male advantage. And so really it's quite tricky to think of a sport where males don't have an advantage.
Right. Okay. That helps clarify things. So, when it comes to decisions about sport categories and participation therein, we're relying upon a mix of factual or empirical claims about what's true about male and female sex differences, how they manifest, and then some value considerations, right? And we're trying to consider all these things together in making our judgments. Um, and so things like obviously biological realities and how they manifest is one. On the value side, there are things like inclusion, fairness, being truthful, I think is one. When it comes to this question of sex and gender in sport, what are the main factors that are in play?
So when we think about sport, there tends to be two groups of people. I'm not just talking about males and females there. There tends to be two kind of moral directives. And people often sort by whether they value fairness in sport and the integrity of categories, and that understanding that sport really can only exist. This is my side. Sport can only exist if we really have fair competition. um, and then there is a group of people who think that sport is about inclusion and that if it can be fair, then that's something that's kind of added value. And there have been, big consultations and big surveys where people are asked, athletes and coaches and team managers, where do you land here? What do you think? And it's very clear that there's quite a difference between the two groups. What's quite interesting is that the athletes and the coaches are very, very overrepresented on the what I call the fairness side. So they're the people who are playing sport, and it's quite clear that their most important value is fair play. People who play sports more recreationally, or perhaps not even sport at all, they're involved administratively or, kind of backroom staff type level, might start to feel that inclusion is more important. So when we think about sport and who is it for and what do we, what is it based around? It's based around these athletes, right? It's based around what athletes can do and what they can achieve and a celebration of their bodies. And that has to be a fair celebration and a fair competition. Sports can be inclusive. I play sport at a recreational level. At the most inclusive level, I play mixed sport, I play single sex sport. This is where people can go and have fun with consent. I know when I'm playing in a team where males are going to be, but it's all fun, and it's all, part of our recreational social lives. We're talking about competition, and in a lot of cases we're talking about competition that doesn't just deliver a win, but along with that win comes, okay, some money, but also opportunities. Okay, women winning means women feeling successful, women being leaders, women going forward in their lives, scholarships at college, those kinds of things. It's important for our whole lives. And so fairness for me really is the value that I don't think sport exists without it. Without fairness, you have exercise.
Yeah, that's really helpful for just delineating the different contexts in which sport can be played because, we're not always talking just about competitive sports. And I know we'll come back to this later about some proposals you have for cutting through some of the difficulties in these areas, but that was helpful for laying out the landscape. Um, you spoke earlier about, in the context of boxing, how the IOC on the one hand has a different position than the regulatory regimes within the sport. I want to ask you more generally, just to help get a sense of the landscape, about the different organizations that have a regulatory role and also the stakeholders. You've talked about athletes and viewers or people to a certain extent. So, what are the main sources of regulation of categories in sport? And then who are these different stakeholder groups that are influencing the debate? And do you see kind of consistency across the sporting world, generally speaking, or is it quite widely divergent? And where do you see the trends going in this regard?
Yeah, so until perhaps 5 or 8 years ago, the leading light in sporting regulation was the International Olympic Committee, the IOC. And they produced guidelines about sex categories, although actually nobody really needed to make guidelines about sex categories, right? It's intuitive, it's obvious. We've known that, for a long time that women can't run as fast as men and they can't jump as long. And in order to have, women succeed, we need sex categories. But the IOC have led historically on what might be called edge cases. So athletes who might be male but who have a medical disorder that means that perhaps they have been registered as female at birth. And so those athletes with a DSD, or now in the case of transgender women, so athletes who are male who identify as women. So these edge cases, how do we categorize those? And the IOC has been, increasingly stringent regarding kind of hormonal suppression, and let's get that testosterone down, and let's have a little period, a period of time to let your muscles kind of diminish a little bit. And actually, in about 4 or 5 years ago now, I started researching this subject. This is really where my story started here. Thinking, well, is that fair? Can you turn a male into a female by doing things like suppressing testosterone, which is the sex hormone that drives all this male development that makes athletic advantage? Can you, by playing with those hormones, turn a male into a female? And it turns out you can't, right? Male development is lifelong. It starts in the womb. Baby boys are longer, they have bigger heads, they've got thicker vertebrae. And then through childhood, they're consistently taller and leaner than girls. And then obviously at puberty, we see, this divergence increase. You can't undo that. And so we started challenging this. I'm one of a, large group of fairly disparate people across. I'm a developmental biologist, but sports scientists and political scientists and sports philosophers who started to challenge this with the IOC and say, hang on, have you really thought about this? we understand you want a solution. We understand you want a fix. You want to be inclusive, but you're compromising fairness. And that's not really what we think sport should be doing. And so the IOC have since stepped back and said that the sports federations must make their own rules. So by that, I mean, if we think about athletics, World Athletics now make their own rules, okay? They were never beholden to the IOC, but now they've officially been kind of cut loose, if you like. And that's the same for all sports federations. They're now making their own rules. And when we look at what they're doing now, we see what I'm going to call the big guns. So World Athletics, cycling, and swimming are all starting to arrive at the same conclusions, which is what I've just said. You can't undo a lifelong pattern of male development. So sports federations are starting to, they've got scientific experts, they've got medics, I think they know their biology. And what we're seeing now is a pattern of, we think we need to be fair to women here, and that means no men.
Okay, yeah, well, it's good to see, I guess, that fairness and integrity of sport is prevailing, but certainly in the public domain, it doesn't necessarily feel like that with some of these issues. So we'll pick that up again later, talking about policy proposals and what have you. But I wanted to return to the question of categories here because it's front and center, of course, with categorization in sport, but more broadly, this issue of of sex and gender and that sort of thing. So with DSD and intersex, this is one of the categories here in question. Um, you wonder kind of does the exception prove or undermine the rule? You had kind of written about how people take intersex as a third sex. They kind of see it that way. You can see how that might be plausible on a first read. Whereas in fact, it's a good example of a defective or divergent developmental process to one or the other sex. And I think, in the attempts to maybe say there's a lot of blurriness between these categories, it's representative of how some ideas that we see that are very prevalent, such as radical equality and the idea that one's dignity lies in having kind of everything subjective or objectively stated about oneself affirmed and turned into a positive. And this is kind of contributing to the definition of concepts. Um, and what we're seeing here increasingly is the use of difference language in the domain of maybe not so much into biology, but how people talk about it, and especially healthcare. I think it could probably become problematic. Is intersex a developmental difference, or is it linked to a defective path of development and have some health repercussions? Is being overweight, in fact, a negative divergence from a weight norm, or is it alternatively sized or something like that. I don't know what you would call it. And this trend of kind of changing language for inclusivity and affirmation, though of course it's linked to equality and dignity has some positive features, but one might also argue it's troubling for rigor and objectivity. Um, Medicine and biology, they're linked to these normative conceptions of development and health and things like that. You're trying to help the patient become healthy as a doctor, and you use your biological knowledge to do so. Um, so, a couple questions for that long preface for you. Do you think that biology and other sciences are being affected positively or negatively by the push for inclusive concepts like this? And how do you see this issue of kind of concept creep or muddy boundaries affecting our ability to make informed judgments in these areas?
So I think the framing of um, disorders of sex development has changed over the years. The language certainly has changed. So you've used the word intersex. Some people reject that, and I think that's a reasonable rejection in the sense that it gives this idea that there is some kind of third or fourth or 12th way between males and females. And that was replaced with disorders of sex development. Now I'm a developmental biologist. I've worked in clinic, alongside clinical genetics all my life on human genetic disorders, these are medical conditions, okay? They're not differences in the sense that a baby born without eyes it doesn't have a different type of sight, right? Or a different type of eye. They have a disorder, it's a genetic disorder. And while in the medical literature, you can write about things like disorders of sex development, in patient-facing language, there has been a shift to talk about, for example, a difference of sex development. And that is about inclusivity. It's also about destigmatizing. It's about, making sure that patients don't feel like they're, they've got a mutation or all of these kinds of negative language. For me, these are very neutral terms. But I do understand why patients don't want to hear that kind of very, kind of Hollywood style X-Men type mutant things going on. But really, we're talking about medical disorders. We're not talking about natural variation. We're not talking about natural differences. Most people with disorders of sex development are infertile. These are not, this is not normal human variation in an evolutionary sense. These are medical disorders that catastrophically, for the most part, affect someone's reproductive capacity. And they're linked to things like hormonal disorders and gene mutations that are all required in this, developmental sense to grow a healthy reproductive system. So I understand why people use differences of sex development, but I reject that as a biologically real kind of framework. It does work in society, which is where you come to that we do have normative ideas about health and, to evoke a bit teleologically, what should be, when we think about development, we understand the destination that, some developing structure is supposed to become. And I get accused of being teleological about this. It's like, no, but I
All
know that
biology is, right?
this
Yeah,
part of
has
the
to be.
brain, if everything develops healthily, is going to become your retina, right? We understand this. We've spent, hundreds of years studying what this little patch of cells is going to be. And it's quite odd to have come from a world just, surrounded by all this kind of, this cell will be this, and if this piece of tissue does this, it's going to be that. To have someone say, "Oh, well, you sound like a creationist," or intelligent designer. No, it's just we know these things. We spent a long time studying them. So the normative thing is interesting from a developmental biology point of view, and it's interesting from a health point of view. You brought in overweight people, and this is something, I have a lot of sympathy. I think probably that's quite normal for overweight people because I'm not entirely sure, there are a lot of trauma kind of responses and a lot of psychology behind it. But that still doesn't mean you can't support people to become healthier. And the idea that someone would say to be healthier is some kind of sociological ideal rather than just a health issue, I find quite interesting. But I have to say, it's not really something that I feel equipped to address, to be honest. This seems way
Mhm.
out of, biology and medicine.
Oh, very interesting. So now returning to the issue of gender and sex in sport, you've been advocating and speaking publicly on this issue now for years, and you've written a few reports for MLI, and a great deal of work on the human rights landscape with Sex Matters and other publications. So a couple questions for you. Has this work and others like it made a positive impact in the way that you hope it would? And where are we headed at with respect to these issues? What do you see emerging on the horizon from a policy perspective, the international level in the UK or here in Canada?
When it comes to sports, I think we have made a huge impact. And that's because a lot of people really get sport. Okay. So if we think about the breadth of policies where sex matters, we can go from anything, I'm going to talk about two poles, and there is a spectrum here. So something like sport, where really it's just your body that matters, and actually your gender identity or what's written on your passport doesn't matter. In fact, sport should be ignoring all of those things in celebration of the diversity of people all coming together in this kind of, very physical celebration of speed and power and strength. So we have sport where it's just bodies. And then if we run through all the other policy issues, we're thinking about single sex spaces in terms of prisons and rape crisis centers. And then we get to the kind of what happens in your toilet in a shopping mall, right, in your bathroom. So all of these places where sex matters, but sport has been the thing that really, I think, captured people. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Like I say, a lot of people play sport. If I was to be uber feminist, I would say a lot of men care about sport. So the issue is captured, an audience that feminists don't often grab. But also it's frankly, it's quite visual. We can look at Valentina Petrillo on a track running as a 51-year-old male, and we can see that he's male, right? This is very obvious to us, and I think it hits right to us thinking, I remember, when I was being beaten up by my big brother or in the playground at school, we understand this mismatch between sexes isn't fair. So sport hits us quite, I think, in our heart. And then we start to think about the other policy issues where it's been a bit tougher. It has been tougher. In the UK, we are making headway in terms of, for example, when children think that they have a opposite sex identity, and we have medicalized those children to some extent via our National Health Service, and now we're starting to pull back along with other European nations here, starting to say, hang on, let's think about the health and well-being of children here. This is, if you're an adult and you want to do some things to yourself, we're going to obviously let you have the autonomy to do that. Who pays for that is a different question. But these are children, and so we've had success with these really kind of quite visceral questions, and I think other things will come from that.
Well, thank you so much, Emma. You've given us a lot to think about from your vantage point over there in the UK. From here in Canada, we're maybe not as far along as you are on some of these issues, so we'll look to you for inspiration. But thank you for joining us. Great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.